I'd like to record my thanks first to ANCLAS for giving me this opportunity to share this paper. I come from Malaysia and we've just set up a Center for Latin American Studies, so I'm happy to be here to share my thoughts on cross-regional engagement between Latin America and ASEAN in particular. In this paper, basically we intend to scope the trade barriers, scope export potentials, broadly using secondary data, and then we did some field work to actually go down and see what are the impediments to trade between Malaysia and Chile, more specifically. To start off a bit on the motivation for this paper, there's been a rising number of cross-regional agreements between Asia and Latin America, especially since 2003. And with that, we see some kind of intensification in trade and investment relations, more in trade particularly. However, what we know in cross-regional engagement between Asia and Latin America, very often ASEAN seems to be missing in the equation. When one thinks of Asia, they think of China, Japan, and South Korea. And likewise, when we think of Latin America, we think of the three big players, Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. So we find that there's a lot of little attention paid to Southeast Asia's engagement with Latin America. And in fact, Latin America has been earmarked by countries in ASEAN, not just Malaysia, to be the gateway for Latin America simply because of the ease of doing business. It's simple, especially Chile, its simple tariff structure and so on. So we believe there are potentials for trade complementarity between ASEAN and Latin America, not just China, Japan, South Korea with Latin America, although trade is at its minimal. Now, this paper basically is part of a larger 2-year project. What we intend to do is to contribute to the existing literature on cross-regional engagement between Asia and LAC with a special focus on Malaysia-Chile bilateral partnership. And the question you could ask is why Chile? Chile has been aggressively pursuing FTAs in the region, and it's the only FTA that Malaysia has with the entire Latin America. And we are looking at Chile to actually penetrate other countries in Latin America, particularly the Pacific Alliance. Recently, ASEAN launched its block-to-block negotiations with Pacific Alliance, but that has somehow tapered a bit. Discussions have become a bit slow, but that's our starting point for our study. So the study actually seeks to estimate empirically what are the export potentials that one can see between Malaysia and Chile in a bilateral perspective. So Chile's export potentials in Malaysia and vice versa, and also to identify some, even if you do not call it barriers to trade, we may call it impediments or challenges. Now, just like any other trade agreement, free trade agreement, the Malaysia-Chile Free Trade Agreement, in short known as the MCFTA, is not a perfect policy trade instrument. Especially when you talk about market access in terms of tariffs, that does not seem to be the issue any longer in today's global trade. What's actually critical is the other residual regulatory impediments, mainly non-tariff barriers that are difficult to quantify and difficult to perceive how stringent they are to exporters. There has been lack of information on market access and these barriers to actually facilitate trade opportunities. So the end aim of this project is to actually inform the policy debate. How do we intensify trade between these two countries, in which sectors, and what are the prevailing challenges that need to be addressed by both parties? Before I start the paper, I'd just like to present some facts and figures to just set the background of the study. Now, export concentration in the Malaysia-Chile partnership is highly skewed. When I say highly skewed or concentrated, just 2 to 3 products dominate trade or exports both ways. So what we find is there's a strong presence of intersectoral trade, hardly any trade overlap. To explain this, if you look at Malaysia's exports to Chile, in fact, Malaysia's exports globally, about 40 to 50% constitutes electronic products, which is not something new to ASEAN because we're actually quite successful in the electronic supply chain. And second, it's followed by furniture. And third, rubber articles, mostly latex gloves. We conquer about 60% of the Chilean market for this. Of course, our close competitor is China. China constitutes the balance, but now we see that it's dropping. Second is Chile's exports to Malaysia in turn is also highly skewed, much more skewed, because copper constitutes almost 76% and followed by fertilizers. But having said that, Chile is also exporting now seafood products and also wine, Chilean wines. Yeah. Okay. So in both countries, this is in terms of export values and volume. In fact, in terms of volume, our total trade with Chile is just in the tune of 470 million, which is quite small actually, US dollars. If you look at trade restrictiveness indices, which is what we want to actually pursue through our fieldwork, if you look at the first panel, this is the overall trade restrictiveness index by Key in 2009. He looks at it overall and by tariffs. What do you mean by overall trade restrictiveness index? This is the trade distortions on the import bundle by both countries, Malaysia and Chile. We can see definitely Malaysia has higher trade policy distortions in terms of the on imports compared to Chile. This is not surprising if we look at the World Economic Forum. Given Chile's simple tariff structure, it ranks ninth, if I'm not mistaken, ninth in terms of domestic tariff market access, in terms of market access, while Malaysia ranks 75th. So that's a huge gap. And if you actually go down to just tariffs, the second column, you can see there's a big gap here. So what's the main message from this table? One is that trade restrictiveness or policy distortions are generally higher in Malaysia, much higher. And second is, if one were to consider tariffs and OTRI, which includes both tariffs and non-tariff barriers, you can see tariffs just constitute a small share. So the large portion of restrictiveness is generally going to come from non-tariff barriers. Now, having said that, is market access only tariffs and non-tariff barriers? When we talk about market access, we actually look at connectivity, infrastructure, logistics, and also the regulatory environment, institutions. Now, what's interesting from this is, again, Chile ranks much higher at the 8th position in terms of the enabling trade index, but Malaysia is much lower at 25. Chile scores better. The higher the score, the better. So World Economic Forum has actually looked at possible outcomes from the range of 1 to 7. So the higher the score, the better positioned you are, and the lower the rank, that means you're better off. But if you look at it in terms of border administration, Chile ranks better, but infrastructure is the only exception to the rule where Malaysia ranks better than Chile. This could be due to reasons for domestic connectivity. I'm not so sure. We haven't really found out what's the major reason, but there's no element of bilateral dimension here. This is just World Economic Forum's positioning of countries along these various dimensions of trade enablers. Now, I'm sorry, I'm an economist. I notice a lot of here are mostly political relations, so I'll just tone down on the econometrics here. The first part of it is just to estimate export potentials. There are several variants of the gravity model out there, highly criticized, but we thought the one that basically depicts trade in this case is actually hinged on newer trade theories. So if you subscribe to economies of scale, differences in factor endowments, and so on, this model fits neatly into what we want to study. But it's just to give us an idea on what are the export potentials both ways and in which sectors. So if I quickly go through the arguments in the model, now that's the total GDP of both countries to measure economies of scale. Similarities in GDP to measure similar income tastes that could drive trade, because if you subscribe to the notion that trade is basically in manufactures, then if you have similar tastes, there's greater leeway for product variety to drive that kind of trade. Geographical distance is the standard argument. total FDI, because trade moves parallel with FDI. It's difficult to generate trade without foreign investment. That's what we see in ASEAN, but it may not be the case in cross-regional agreements or cross-regional trade. Similarities in invert FDI: if you subscribe to the view that FDI drives trade, then similar stocks of invert FDI in both the partner and host country would actually generate importing and exporting capabilities and relative factor endowment differences. Yeah. So if you actually have intersectoral trade, that means the trade overlap is very, very minimal, then you will have factor endowment differences driving that kind of trade. But if your trade overlap is very high, then similar factor endowments are going to drive trade. I will leave the indices, how they're calculated now. We built a panel database of three-dimensional, looking at sorry, it's not China, ASEAN, it's Malaysia Chile trade. We looked at 15 product groups at the 15-digit level. Why we had to go down to a very broad category? Because there are plenty of zero trade values, because the trade, is highly concentrated in specific sectors. Now, what's more interesting, what I would like to share from our field work is the in-depth interviews we did with about 12 key people in Chile. We did a field work in Santiago for about 2 weeks. So we interviewed Pro-Chile, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, SOFOFA, Asia Pacific Chamber of Commerce, and Santiago Chamber of Commerce. So most of the trade associations and the government ministries engaged in trade, we actually interviewed them to find out what are the major hurdles or bottlenecks they face in trading with Malaysia. And we did the same thing in Malaysia with the trade associations in Malaysia. Now, in terms of trade potentials, I will just go very briefly that we derive from the empirical estimates. Clearly, trade potentials of Chile in Malaysia. Now, we used that empirical model to do the estimations. So if the predicted values exceed the actual values, meaning that it's above unity, then their potentials for expansion in those sectors or overall, which means you are indirectly under trading on those sectors. But if the predicted is less, then you're over trading. So just a quick diagram to show you the potentials are definitely higher for Malaysia to engage in Chile than vice versa. And in Chile, in the case of Malaysia, since we note higher potentials, though we have been exporting a lot of electronic components, furniture, and also inorganic chemicals, what we see is a sudden surge in manufactures of base metals. This is something very interesting because there's a huge demand in Chile from the construction and mining sectors, and at the moment there's been an increase of more than 126% over the last 3 years. I'll go quickly, since I only have about a couple of minutes, to the qualitative analysis based on our interviews. Now, we like to highlight the Malaysian perspective first. We are exporting furniture, rubber, so we are looking at these two major exports to see what are the big problems, and of course electronics. Now, the furniture sector, looking at our Malaysian traders, they do not find any major barriers in exporting to Chile because they find the customs procedure here less stringent, although they seriously look to markets like Europe and US. These are major markets, but in terms of Chile, they do not have any problems, though Chile has quite strict requirements on product standards. However, what they note is they are less focused on the Chilean market, mainly because they have a huge competitor in terms of China. China is able to actually service the entire spectrum of demand from low-range furniture to medium and high-end. Whereas in Malaysia, we are exporting a lot of it. It comes from rubber wood. So rubber wood furniture is able to only serve a niche market within the medium range. And it's basically, our competitiveness is basically in terms of design and quality. If you look at price, we are unable to actually compete directly in Chile. So we see in terms of furniture, there's no big move. Companies are not intending to move into Chile in a big way. It's kind of exhausted. And in the case of rubber products, of course, their concern is the Chinese presence in Chile, because our latex gloves, we are competing at the moment with the Chinese-made latex gloves, but the quality of the Malaysian-made latex gloves supersede that of China. So in that sense, we're still able to actually dominate a substantial portion of the market in Chile. What's interesting that I share with the previous speakers is food products. Now, Chile is looking to Malaysia to actually move into higher value added processing to process their salmon and trout. And what we notice is that at the moment, in terms of exports, they are unable to export because although there's this huge market for snacks and confectionery, they are unable to export because they're not able to compete on price on the price level. So Trade in Santiago has been actually aggressively trying to promote processed food by drawing in these SMEs, and they've actually failed. And one of the reasons, some of the reasons cited is, one is these SMEs, when you talk about barriers to trade, they are actually not an issue of whether those non-tariff measures or those barriers or those product standards, it's not an issue whether they are legitimate. It's actually an issue of compliance. So the way one looks at non-tariff barriers is very different from non-tariff measures is very different from barriers, because not all non-tariff measures are barriers. So in this case, they note that Malaysian companies, because they are small, one of the problems is they look for a sole distributor in Chile. They have problems. One is because of the language. The sole distributor, of course, is they have problems communicating with the sole distributor. And counterproductive to all this is that when you have a sole distributor and you have a minor player like Malaysia, this sole distributor is pushing multiple lines of products. They look at Malaysia as something very minor. So the Malaysian counterpart loses quite a bit in terms of weak sales and loss of control. The sole distributor does not take the vested interests of the Malaysian trader. Second is the TBT issues. I stand corrected on this. I think they actually had a new law which is called Nutritional Composition of Nutrients and the Advertising, which was passed in July 2012, which actually is very stringent. It's over and above the normal standards that one requires when you actually, let's say, export food. You have the nutritional values, you have the details of the expiry date of that particular product, and you have information on the manufacturer, importer, and so on. But what Chile has in addition to all that is, because of obesity and so on, they have what is called food products that should be labeled as high in fat, sugar, and calories or salt. And Johnson actually from the USTR mentioned this is quite a drawback for companies, especially SMEs, to actually comply with this. Yeah, because they have to have these label warnings. Yeah? So compliance is one. Now, from the Chilean perspective, mining, no problems at all. 76% of their total exports are copper. But what's important is Chile is now moving and pursuing aggressively to export halal-based products to Malaysia. Now, what is halal? Halal means that it has to be produced in accordance with Islamic practices, and this covers the whole range from slaughtering, storage, display, preparation, hygiene, and sanitation. When one thinks of halal, they just think of slaughtering, but it's not the case. And if you look at Chile's food exports, if you categorize it broadly as food, there are four main product categories. One is dried fruits, seafood, which have no problems getting into the Malaysian halal market. But the one that's a big bottleneck is dairy products and meat preparations. Now, they are facing huge problems, and JAKIM, the Malaysian Islamic Development Center, is the one that is allowed to give the certification. The Islamic Center in Santiago is only allowed to give the certification for dried fruits and seafood, because JAKIM in Malaysia is suspicious whether the Islamic Center in Chile would be able to accord the certification appropriately. Now, you may ask, why bother? After all, at the end of the day, food products is quite minimal exports. But The halal food sector in Southeast Asia is very big because you have Muslim-dominated countries like Indonesia, and Malaysia's certification is very important because it's recognized worldwide. So getting into Malaysia and getting that certification means getting into Indonesia and also the whole of Middle East, because the Middle East, Dubai, Saudi recognize our certification. However, what we know is the Islamic Center seems to misinterpret in Santiago the requirements for halal food. They seem to think that every person in the slaughterhouse has to be a Muslim. So we find the way in which the laws have been interpreted in Santiago is very, very different. And we suspect some kind of lack of transparency, and probably is to actually protect their employees or so on, because they're trying to get in their Muslim employees into, but that's not what JAKIM wants in Malaysia. So I believe last week JAKIM and 80 group delegation went down to Santiago to settle this problem. So based on this, I would say that the empirical findings suggest, if you look at the current trade flows, we're actually overtrading in the major sectors. We are overtrading, Chile is overtrading in mining, and we are overtrading, if you look at it broadly, in electronics and furniture. But having said that, the empirical estimates cannot be taken seriously because we've looked at very broad categories at 15 sector level, and we are not able to nail down the subsectors. And fewer restrictions are noted, naturally, because trade engagement is still somewhat low. But what we notice is from both sides, from the Malaysian side, we find the Chilean food sector quite stringent because of these warnings that they have on food that is high in fat, sugar, calories, and so on. From the Malaysian side, they find that our certification requirements are quite stringent. But it's not a question of whether these are really barriers. It's actually a question of procedures to secure compliance. So with this, we actually recommend feasibility studies to actually look at the food sector clearly, because Chilean exports of meat preparations has great potentials to penetrate all markets. So, and the other one that we're looking at is electronic components. Just 1 minute, please. Yeah, electronic components. Now, the reason why Pacific Alliance wants to form a block-to-block negotiation, one of the core fundamental reasons is to actually emulate the supply chain networks that we have. This sounds far-fetched when you look at regions which are very geographically distant. The reality is they are distant, transaction costs are high. But if you look at this case, in the case of electronics, they could actually come, because manufacturers of base metals are actually rising. The Chambers of Commerce recommend the Malaysian companies who actually produce these manufacturers of base metals to actually set up next to the lead firms in the construction and mining. So we're also looking at supply chains that could be forged regionally, nationally, not regionally like the ones that we see in ASEAN. So moving the research forward, we're undertaking currently the feasibility on the halal food sector, and we're also doing a survey on both sides, on the firms on both sides. And we're also looking at the ASEAN Business Council, the ABC, to actually kind of spur this trade, because they actually have been focused very much regionally to move the ASEAN economic community and have not looked at Latin America in a big way. And you need big players to go in so that countries in Southeast Asia do not lose out in terms of first mover advantages relative to countries such as China, Japan, and South Korea. Thank you.